This recording is for Unit 1.4, the carbon and oxygen cycle. Now before we get into the carbon and oxygen cycle itself, or how carbon and oxygen move through our environments, we need to talk a little bit more specifically about what carbon and oxygen are. So carbon and oxygen are both elements. You can find them on the periodic table. However, when we find them in the environment, they're most commonly in one of these two different forms. This top form, or CO2, is known as carbon dioxide, and the appropriate way to write this is big C, big O, little 2. Carbon dioxide is a gas, and it can be found in all sorts of different places in the environment, dissolved in water, in the atmosphere, and in living organisms. Our second molecule is called oxygen gas, or diatomic oxygen. And again, it's most appropriately written big O with a little 2, or subscript 2. And again, this gas can be found in all the same places that carbon dioxide is. In the environment, dissolved in the water, in the atmosphere, in different living organisms' tissues. So now that we know what the main elements are that are going to be involved in the carbon and oxygen cycle, I want to talk about two of the main processes that are in the carbon and oxygen cycle. The first of those processes is photosynthesis. So the first question is, who goes through photosynthesis, or who uses the process of photosynthesis? Most people are familiar with the idea that plants go through photosynthesis, but we don't want to forget some of these others, such as algae and some bacteria. Remember from what we learned in food chains that all of these organisms that go through photosynthesis are called the producers. Now the next question is, why do these plants, algae, and bacteria go through photosynthesis? Well, they have the ability to take the sun's energy and turn it into something else that they can use for energy. And that something else is a glucose, or a sugar. So they can use the sun's energy to make a sugar. And the specific sugar that they make, again, is called glucose. Now that glucose then can be used to do all sorts of things in plants, such as building tissues, used for energy. It's very versatile. So glucose is their fuel of choice. The sunlight just helps them to make that glucose. Okay, so the process of photosynthesis takes some materials to actually get it going. So what goes into this reaction is called the reactants. So the reactants for our process are going to be carbon dioxide and water. So that's what we need to get photosynthesis started. That makes sense. Plants need some air and some water in order to grow. What are we going to get out of this process? We call the products. In other words, what do we produce? And the result of photosynthesis, as we already said, is number 1, glucose, this sugar. But it also makes some other products that the plant doesn't directly use. First of all, photosynthesis makes oxygen gas. So those are the two main ones that we want to make sure we include in our reaction, or our equation. So the overall equation for photosynthesis, I'll put this together, is CO2 plus H2O, there are reactants, yields, or ends up making, glucose plus oxygen gas. Now we're forgetting one thing in our reactants here, and it's not really reactant, so that's why I didn't write it in. But don't forget that we do need the sunlight, so we need light to get this reaction started. Of course, your plants all need light, right, to grow. So light is the stimulant to this whole process. Okay, so that's photosynthesis and how it uses carbon dioxide and oxygen. The process that uses carbon dioxide and oxygen in living systems is called cellular respiration. Now don't get this confused with breathing. We call the respiratory system your system that helps you to breathe. This is different. This is cellular respiration. So this happens in each and every one of your cells, not just in your lungs. And in fact, it happens in the cells of a lot of organisms. So if we look at who goes through this process of cellular respiration, it's almost all living organisms. There are a couple types of bacteria that don't use cellular respiration, a couple types of fungus, but for the most part, almost all organisms do this. So for our purposes, please remember that. So this includes plants. So yes, plants do go through respiration when we're talking about cellular respiration. Animals, most fungi, think about like mushrooms when you think of fungi. Most protists are little single-celled organisms that swim around in the water. And then some bacteria. So they all go through this process of respiration. So what is this process that's so important that most living things do it? Well, cellular respiration makes energy. And we know that energy is responsible for all the living processes in these organisms. The special type of energy that cellular respiration makes is something called ATP. And I want you to remember that is really important because we're going to come back to that many times. This ATP is that energy that all living things use. And that's our goal in cellular respiration. Okay, so now we're going to get to the ins and the outs again. So remember, the ins are what we call the reactants. And the ins in cellular respiration are actually the outs or the products of photosynthesis. So what did photosynthesis make again? It made some glucose and it made some oxygen. So those are the reactants or the starting products we need for respiration. Think about it. You need, in order to make energy, glucose in the form of your food and oxygen that you breathe in through the air. That's how you make energy for your muscles and the rest of your body to function. What do we get out of that reaction? Well, I've already specified that we get ATP, so that's our energy, and we also get, as a byproduct, carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, and then finally water, which we might sweat out or urinate. Okay, these two again are the ins of photosynthesis, or the reactants of photosynthesis, and they are the products of cellular respiration. So if we put them together in equation once more, what we're looking at then is our reactants, glucose plus oxygen yields or makes ATP plus carbon dioxide plus water. So there's our reaction for cellular respiration. Once again, carbon dioxide and oxygen are integral parts of this reaction. So now that we know a little bit about dioxide and oxygen and how they're used in reactions, we can look at the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle describes how carbon dioxide and oxygen move through the ecosystems. So how they are transferred from one thing to another. The things that I have in green here, such as atmosphere, plants, animals, fossil fuels, soil, and ocean, all of those are places where we can find carbon dioxide in the ecosystems or in the environment. So we're going to look at how does the carbon dioxide and oxygen move through these different sinks, is what we call them, or areas that hold the carbon dioxide. So the first one we're going to look at, because we've been already talking about this, is how does it move between plants in the atmosphere and animals in the atmosphere. Well, we know one way that carbon dioxide can move out of the atmosphere and into the atmosphere is through photosynthesis and respiration, because we just talked about those. We're going to take our photosynthesis, we're going to move it over to our area where our plants are and connect that to the atmosphere. And then we take our respiration, move it over to where the animals are, and connect that to the atmosphere. But remember, plants also go through respiration, so we're going to move that over by the plants and connect that as well to the atmosphere. Okay, now we're going to draw some arrows to show the direction that these processes move carbon dioxide. Remember, through respiration, animals release carbon dioxide. So we're going to show the carbon dioxide moving from the animals to the atmosphere. So that's the direction of our carbon dioxide movement. Same for plants. Respiration causes carbon dioxide to move into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis, however, takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and returns it to plants. So we need to add one more arrow to the plants to show the carbon dioxide being taken out of the atmosphere and into the plants. Now, carbon dioxide can also move between plants and animals through something called digestion. So I'm going to put digestion, let me erase that for a second here, put digestion right between the plants and animals. Because animals eat plants, the carbon dioxide is going to move from the plants to the animals via digestion. So the arrow is going to go from the plants to the animals. Alright, these other places where we store carbon dioxide we need to think about as well. Now the ocean and the atmosphere exchange carbon dioxide back and forth between them, kind of like the plants in the atmosphere do. And that process is something we call diffusion. So oxygen moves back and forth, so from the ocean to the atmosphere, and then also back from the atmosphere to the ocean via this process of diffusion. So it's constantly cycling back and forth between the ocean and the atmosphere as a gas. Carbon can also get into the soil through a process called decomposition. So when plants and animals die, they decompose, and their remains, which includes carbon, get into the soil. So we remove decomposition from plants and animals, which puts carbon dioxide into the soil. So we draw arrows moving it down to the soil. But then decomposition can also move carbon dioxide from plants and animals into what we call fossil fuels. So I'm going to draw some more arrows that go over there. Now if things decay very, very slowly, instead of just decomposing into the soil, they turn into the fossil fuels like oil, gas, like natural gas, and coal. So decomposing organisms can end up in two different places. Now the last one we need to talk about is this connection between the fossil fuels and the atmosphere. So the fossil fuels that we burn in our cars or in our furnaces or anywhere else that we use oil, gas, and coal go through this process called combustion. Combustion literally means to burn. So we're going to add that to our diagram here. When we burn oil, gas, or coal, we're putting that carbon that's in those fossil fuels from those dead plants and animals back into the atmosphere. And scientists have shown that there is a direct link between those oil, gas, and coal carbon dioxide molecules or carbon molecules and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As we use more oil, gas, and coal, we see more of those carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere. And that contributes to climate change. It changes our atmosphere. So the carbon cycle, once again, relies heavily on both photosynthesis and respiration, which move carbon dioxide and oxygen back and forth between plants, animals, and the atmosphere. But there are also these other places where we can find carbon, such as the ocean, the soil, and fossil fuel. And the processes in orange help to move the carbon dioxide between those sources as well. Notice there's no beginning or end of this process. The carbon can keep recycling through over and over again into these different areas. Take